When most Australians hear the word pension in retirement, they picture one thing. But in this country, that single word describes two completely different sources of income, and mixing them up is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make heading into retirement. The first is an account-based pension. That is your own money. The super you spent decades building, converted into a regular income stream. It belongs to you. You control how much you draw and when. The second is the age pension. That is a government payment of $1,144.40 per fortnight, which works out to $29,754 per year, paid to eligible Australians who meet an age and assets test. It has nothing to do with your super balance. It comes from a completely separate system, funded by taxpayers. Here is where it gets expensive. Many people near retirement assume that starting a pension from their super automatically gives them access to the age pension as well. It does not work that way. In fact, starting an account-based pension at the wrong time or with the wrong super balance can actually reduce your age pension entitlement, sometimes by thousands of dollars a year. I have watched this play out with people who had $180,000 in super. They did what their friends told them. They started a pension, and they ended up with less total income than someone who took a completely different approach with the same balance. The amount you withdraw, the timing, and the structure you choose, all of those decisions feed directly into the government's means test. And most people make those decisions without understanding how the test actually works. So if you have ever felt confused about whether you can get both, you are not alone. The system uses the same word for two different things. That confusion is real, and it is costing retirees real money. Let me show you exactly how much. I used to think starting a pension was always the right move. I would say it with confidence. Then I ran the numbers for someone with $180,000 in super and realized I had been giving advice that was actually making them poorer. That was a humbling moment. Standard retirement advice assumes you have a large super balance, $500,000 or more, where the main benefit of pension phase is getting your investment earnings into a zero-tax environment. At that level, the strategy works well. But if you have under $200,000 in super, the math runs completely differently, and almost no one explains this. Here is what that actually looks like in numbers. If you have $200,000 in super and follow the standard advice to start a pension, you are immediately required to withdraw a minimum of 4% per year. That is $8,000 in your first year. Your super balance is now assessed under the income test, which reduces any age pension entitlement you might have had. But what if you took a different approach? If you instead took a $50,000 lump sum to renovate your home or pay off remaining debt, your assessable assets drop to $150,000. At $150,000, you are well inside the full age pension zone. For a single homeowner, the full pension threshold is $314,000. So you now qualify for the full age pension, $29,754 per year. Draw $8,000 from your remaining super, and your total income is $37,754. Compared to the pension-only approach where you only receive $8,000 from your super drawdown, that is $29,754 per year more. Same super balance, different decision, completely different outcome. This is not a loophole. It is how the system is actually designed. The problem is that people with modest balances are receiving advice designed for people with much larger ones. Let me put a real face on this. Jenny is 62. She recently retired after working in retail management for most of her adult life. She owns her home outright. She has $185,000 in super and no debt. Just about everyone she knows has told her to start a pension. But something about that advice does not sit right with her. She is right to feel that way. That advice was not written with her situation in mind. If Jenny opens an account-based pension with her full $185,000, the government assesses that balance under the income test using deeming rates. Her age pension entitlement gets reduced. She ends up with a part pension of roughly $18,000 per year, plus her minimum super drawdown of around $7,400. Total income, approximately $25,400 per year, and by her mid-70s, her super is largely depleted. She is fully dependent on whatever the age pension pays at that point, with no buffer left. Now look at what happens if Jenny takes a different approach. She takes $50,000 as a lump sum and puts it into her home. New roof, updated kitchen. That money becomes part of her primary residence, which is exempt from the assets test. Her remaining $135,000 stays in accumulation, continuing to grow. She draws $5,000 per year from it for extras. And because her assessable assets are now $135,000, well below the $314,000 threshold, she qualifies for the full age pension, that is $29,754 per year, plus $5,000 from super. Total income, $34,754 per year. Her home is improved, future maintenance costs are lower, and her super lasts longer because she is not depleting it quickly. The fragility path leaves Jenny with $25,400 per year in super that is largely gone by 75. The resilience path gives her $34,754 per year and a super balance still intact in her late 70s. The difference is not financial sophistication. It is knowing which question to ask first. If you are sitting there thinking that sounds like your situation, hit subscribe. This channel exists specifically for Australians who feel like the standard retirement advice was not written with them in mind. Because for a lot of people with modest super balances, it genuinely was not. But you can still make the system work for you. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Because the advice to always start a pension hides a second trap, one that can cost you tens of thousands even if you have a bigger balance. Let me show you the math that most people miss. The minimum drawdown rule sounds harmless on paper. You retire, you start a pension, and the government requires you to withdraw a set percentage each year. For someone under 65, that rate is 4%. For 65 to 74, it rises to 5%. For 75 to 79, it goes to 6%. For 80 to 84, it is 7%, and from 85 onwards, 9%. In a normal market, these percentages feel manageable. But in a downturn, they create a serious problem. Because you are required to make that withdrawal regardless of what the market is doing. This is called sequence of returns risk. It is one of the biggest destroyers of retirement portfolios in the first 5 years. And most people have never heard the term until they are already inside it. Here is what it looks like in practice. A client I worked with, let us call him Mark, retired in January 2020 with $600,000 in super. He started an account-based pension immediately, following standard advice. Then the market dropped. By April 2020, his balanced portfolio had fallen around 20%. His $600,000 was now worth approximately $480,000. But here is the problem. He still had to meet his minimum drawdown obligation. Based on his balance at the start of the financial year, that was $24,000. He had to sell units at the worst possible time to generate that cash. At its lowest point, the ASX 200 had fallen around 36% from its peak. Mark's diversified portfolio had not dropped as far, but it had still taken a significant hit. Those losses were locked in the moment he sold. When the market eventually recovered, Mark's portfolio had fewer units to participate in the recovery. He had sold some of them at the bottom. The long-term damage to his retirement balance took nearly 4 years to work through. Now compare that to a different approach. What if Mark had kept $100,000 in a cash buffer, in an offset account or a high-interest savings account, before starting his pension? He delays starting the pension for 2 years. During the 2020 downturn, he lives off the cash buffer. His super stays invested and untouched. He does not sell a single unit at a loss. By the time he begins drawing down his pension, the market has recovered and his balance is back above where it started. Same retirement date, same starting balance. But one approach locks in losses permanently, the other avoids them entirely. The cash buffer strategy is not complicated. It does not require a financial advisor. It just requires knowing the risk exists before you make the decision. This matters even more for people with modest balances. If Mark had started with $200,000 instead of $600,000, a 20% portfolio drop plus a forced $8,000 minimum drawdown would leave his account at roughly $152,000. At that level, sequence of returns risk is not just painful, it can permanently change the shape of your retirement. Starting a pension immediately at retirement is not always the right move. The tax-free earnings in pension fees are genuinely valuable, but they come with an obligation: selling investment assets at whatever price the market is offering every year, whether that suits you or not. And in the first few years of retirement, that obligation carries real risk. So if starting a pension is not always the answer, and taking a lump sum is not always this answer, what do you actually do? The answer comes down to one number that most people do not know. Let me show you how to find yours. If you have been putting this decision off for months or years, I want to say something before we go further. You are not lazy. You are not bad with money. You are doing exactly what a human brain is wired to do when the stakes feel high and the options feel complicated. This has a name. It is called the status quo bias. Your brain scans every option on the table and finds a downside in each one. Wrong timing, wrong tax decision, run out of money, lose the age pension. So it lands on the option with no immediate pain: do nothing. Leave the super where it is. Think about it next month. The problem is that doing nothing is still a decision. You just made it by default rather than by choice. And doing nothing carries its own costs that are easy to overlook. Super sitting in the accumulation phase is taxed at 15% on earnings. There is no age pension positioning happening. There is no plan for longevity. Every year you delay is a year you paid tax you did not need to pay and missed income you were entitled to. I did this myself. When I turned 60, I spent 14 months doing absolutely nothing because I was terrified of getting it wrong. I told myself I would look into it properly. Next week, after the holidays, when things settled down. Finally, I sat down one afternoon, wrote down 2 numbers, and made a decision. That was it. I had wasted over a year of positioning time. The fear is understandable, but the cost of waiting is real and measurable. Here is something worth knowing about analysis paralysis in retirement planning. It is rarely caused by a lack of information. Most people in their 60s have read the articles, watched the videos, talked to friends. The problem is that they have absorbed too many conflicting pieces of advice and cannot see which one applies to their specific situation. That is actually a fixable problem, because your situation comes down to 2 numbers, not 20. The first number is your super balance. The second is whether you own your home outright. Those 2 facts determine which zone you are in and which strategy genuinely applies to you. So here is one concrete shift. Pick a date 30 days from now. Write it somewhere visible. That is your decision date. Between now and then, your only job is to find those 2 numbers and write them down. Nothing more. On that date, you will have enough to take the first small step. Not the perfect step, just the first one. Once you have those 2 numbers, the next step is actually straightforward. Let me walk you through the process. Once you have your 2 numbers, the decision tree becomes much clearer. Here is the 3-step framework that works regardless of your super balance. Step 1 is knowing your age pension gap. Your age pension gap is simply the difference between your assessable assets and the key thresholds on the assets test. For a single homeowner, those thresholds are $314,000 for the full pension and $695,500 for the part pension cutoff. Both figures apply from the 1st of July, 2026. Your assessable assets include your super balance, savings, and investment assets, but not your home. Knowing where you sit relative to those numbers is the most important calculation in your retirement plan. It determines everything else. Step 2 is choosing your withdrawal method based on your zone. If your assessable assets are under $314,000, you are in the full pension zone. In this zone, a targeted lump sum withdrawal is worth exploring seriously. Using that lump sum to improve your home, reduce debt, or contribute toward a granny flat move's assets into your primary residence, which is exempt from the assets test. You keep your remaining super in accumulation and draw down minimally. The age pension becomes your primary income base. If your assessable assets fall between $314,000 and $695,500, you are in the part pension zone. The decision here is more nuanced. You are already receiving some age pension, but you may benefit from a partial transfer into pension phase to access tax-free earnings, while being careful not to reduce your part pension entitlement further. The transfer balance cap is $2,100,000, so the cap itself is not a constraint at this balance level. The question is how much to move and when. If your assessable assets are over $695,500, you are in the self-funded zone. Starting a pension makes strong sense here. The tax-free earnings in pension phase at this level are genuinely significant. At a 7% return on $2,100,000, your annual earnings would be roughly $147,000. In the accumulation phase, those earnings attract a 15% tax, approximately $22,000 per year. In pension phase, that tax disappears entirely. That is a meaningful and ongoing saving that compounds over time. Step 3 is setting up a cash buffer. Regardless of which zone you are in, keep 1 to 2 years of living expenses in cash outside your super. An offset account, a savings account, or a short-term term deposit all work well. This single step removes the biggest risk we covered earlier, being forced to sell investment assets at the worst possible time. For most Australians in the modest to middle super range, that buffer sits somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. It is not dead money. It is protection against the one risk that can permanently damage a retirement portfolio in those critical first few years. The goal of these 3 steps is not perfection. It is avoiding the most costly mistakes at the moment when they matter most. You do not need to get every detail exactly right. You need to know which zone you are in and build from there. Now, I know this can still feel like a lot to take in at once. Let me give you one final thought that might simplify how you see the whole thing. Here is what I want you to hold on to from this video. The 3 options for your super at retirement, starting a pension, taking a lump sum, or leaving it in accumulation, are not one-size-fits-all solutions. They are tools, and the right tool depends on your super balance, your home ownership status, and where you sit on the age pension assets test. The advice to always start a pension is not wrong for everyone. It is wrong for the people it was never designed for. And if your super balance is under $200,000, following that advice, without checking the numbers first, can cost you more than $20,000 per year in income you were entitled to. The fear of taking it all out is also misplaced. A targeted lump sum used strategically can unlock more total income than a pension alone, particularly when it puts you inside the full age pension zone. And the do-nothing option is not safe. It is just slow. The 15% tax on your super earnings keeps accumulating. The age pension clock keeps ticking. The positioning window gets shorter every year you wait. You do not need to be a financial expert to navigate this well. You need two numbers, a rough sense of which zone you are in, and a date in your calendar for when you will make your first decision. Not a perfect one, just the first one. If this video helped you see your situation a little more clearly, hit subscribe. I am here every week breaking down the retirement system for regular Australians, not just those with $2 million in super. You do not need to be a financial expert to retire well. You just need to know which questions to ask, and now you do.